A very brief introduction to the Enarrationes in Psalmos, the Expositions on the Psalms by Augustine. This will be the second video in a short series on my new book, Augustine's Preaching and the Healing of Desire, in the Enarrationes in Psalmos, the Expositions on the Psalms. Oh, and here are two copies two volumes I happen to have in my office of the Expositions on the Psalms by Augustine, and the other 4 volumes are at home. It's a large 6-volume series of commentaries on the Psalms by Christian church father Augustine, or Christian philosopher, if you prefer to call him that. Maybe there's some overlap in the Venn diagrams there. Anyway, probably the only reason we do not regard the Expositions on the Psalms, the Enarrationes in Psalmos, as Augustine's greatest work, as his magnum opus, probably the only reason we don't think of these as his greatest work is that he wrote so many good books. Maybe competing with the Confessions, the Expositions on the Psalms never stood much of a chance, but they are a magnificent literary and theological achievement. They deserve considerably more attention than they get. 6 volumes in this English translation. The Expositions are impressive for their content as well as their length. What they actually are is a complete set of commentaries on the Psalms as they had come down to Augustine, meaning, for the most part, a set of pre-Vulgate Latin translations from the Greek Septuagint. That would be the Vetus Latina, or Vetus Latina, the ancient Latin translations of the Bible, which were made, in the case of the Old Testament, from the Greek translation, the Septuagint. However, Augustine is interested in the original Hebrew, and he does grow in his ability to consult the biblical Greek, so it's not 100% focused on the early Latin translations alone. Never straying far from pastoral interests, if straying at all. Probably it's better to say never straying at all from pastoral interests. A large portion of the expositions are actually sermons. Sermons with a lot of theology packed in and conveyed in some lovely writing. I would say the most boring of the expositions are still rather interesting, and the least boring are just dazzling pieces. Philosophy or theology or biblical commentary. Very interesting sermons to read. Sermons with a lot of theology and some lovely writing. And the theology itself is particularly interesting for its strategy of Christian psalm interpretation. Now, what do scholars say about the expositions these days? Well, scholars say a lot. Probably the most important contribution comes from the work of people like Michael Cameron and Michael Friedrichs and others, including Andrew Hoffer, Kimberly Baker, and more you could find in my footnotes. And I refer specifically to their work in explaining Augustine's idea of the Totus Christus, the whole Christ. Augustine learned to think of Christ and church as sharing the same identity in accordance with New Testament theology, stuff Paul talks about in the New Testament. And there is a shared voice of Christ and church in the Psalms. He took Christ to be speaking in the Psalms, and the Psalms are writings of David that prophesied Christ, and they prophesied Christ not merely by predicting some details concerning him, but by actually giving utterance to his words. They are the words through which Christ speaks. And if it's 2 in 1 flesh, as Paul describing marriage and saying that this 2 in 1 flesh, Old Testament language for marriage from the book of Genesis, is a symbol of Christ and the church and their intimate relationship. That's what Paul says. And Augustine says, if it's 2 in 1 flesh, why not 2 in 1 voice? If 2 in 1 flesh, why not 2 in 1 voice? And those 2 are Christ and the church speaking in 1 voice in the Psalms. Now, there's different I hate to say stages, maybe phases is better, different moments in the development of this theology in Augustine's interpretation of the Psalm. And if you want a picture of how it develops, I think you'd want to read a book by Michael Cameron in particular. That book is called Christ Meets Me Everywhere. It's over there. I don't think it's in the camera, but it is on the shelves. Christ Meets Me Everywhere by Michael Cameron. And I do my best to explain these things in the introduction to my book, but the real fun is in the rest of the book, and especially in the expositions on the Psalms themselves. And we'll get closer towards looking at some of that in the next video. And again, thank you for watching.